You walk into the room prepared. You have the data, you have the logic, you have the reasonable offer, and you still lose. Not because you were wrong, not because your case was weak, but because the other person was playing a different game entirely, one you did not know existed until it was already over. You replay the conversation afterward. You find the exact moment it slipped, the pause that lasted too long, the concession you made that you didn't need to make, the smile they gave you right before they took everything you left on the table. You told yourself you were being reasonable, collaborative, fair, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a place you don't like to visit, you wonder if that was the problem. Most people enter negotiations believing they are conversations, two parties, both reasonable, both seeking a middle ground that works for everyone. You bring good faith, you bring honesty, you bring the quiet hope that if you are decent enough, the other side will meet you there. They won't. Not always. Not even usually. And the cost of that belief, the belief that negotiations are about fairness, is not just a bad deal, it is the slow erosion of everything you are trying to build. Your business, your position, your life's work handed over in small pieces to people who understood something you refused to. This is not cynicism. This is not a call to become ruthless or cold or dishonest. This is something older, something that was written down 5 centuries ago by a man who had watched kingdoms fall, alliances collapse, and brilliant men lose everything, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked understanding. Machiavelli did not write a negotiation manual. He wrote something far more dangerous. He wrote the truth about what human beings actually are when something they want is on the table. Niccolò Machiavelli was not a philosopher who theorized from a distance. He was a man who sat in rooms where everything was at stake. For 14 years as a Florentine diplomat, he negotiated with popes who smiled and plotted simultaneously, with condottieri, mercenary generals who pledged loyalty and sold it the following week, with rulers who made agreements in the morning and broke them by evening, not out of malice, but out of the cold, simple logic of self-interest. He watched brilliant men lose everything, not to superior force, but to superior understanding of what was actually happening in the room. And when Florence fell, when the Medici returned and stripped him of everything, his office, his position, his identity, he sat down in exile and did something nobody expected. He wrote the truth. Not the truth men wished existed, the truth he had watched operate, silently and without mercy, in every negotiation, every alliance, every moment where two human beings sat across from each other with something they both wanted. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, in essence, that the wise man must understand this above all. Men are moved not by what is fair, but by what is necessary. Not by what they promised, but by what still serves them. Not by goodwill extended to them, but by the quiet calculation of what they stand to gain or lose in this precise moment. This is the concept Machiavelli returned to again and again. Necessità, necessity, the force that actually governs human behavior when something real is on the table. Not ethics, not reciprocity, not the relationship you thought you had built. Necessity. And sitting alongside necessity always is virtù, the force of will, clarity, and adaptability that determines whether you are shaped by circumstances or whether you shape them. Every negotiation is a collision between these two forces. Fortuna sets the terms, necessity drives both sides, and virtù, yours or theirs, decides everything. To understand why you keep losing at the negotiating table, or why you keep winning less than you should, you have to stop examining your tactics and start examining your assumptions. Because the tactics are not the problem. The assumptions are. Machiavelli built his entire understanding of power on a single, unflinching premise, one that most people spend their entire lives quietly rejecting because accepting it would require them to change everything. In The Prince, he wrote that men are, by nature, ungrateful, fickle, simulators and dissemblers, avoiders of danger, and hungry for gain. He did not write this with bitterness. He wrote it the way a navigator writes about currents, not to curse the ocean, to cross it safely. There are three mechanisms operating in every negotiation that Machiavelli understood completely and that most people never see until the deal is already done and the damage is already settled. The first mechanism, generosity without power, is weakness. You have been taught in some form that generosity builds goodwill, that making the first concession signals maturity, that softening your position early creates an atmosphere of collaboration that the other side will naturally want to honor. Machiavelli watched this belief ruin men. In The Prince, he observed, in essence, that men forget the death of a father sooner than the loss of their inheritance. What he was mapping is this: people are not governed by what you have given them. They are governed by what they stand to lose or gain right now, in this moment, at this table. When you open a negotiation with generosity, when you make the first concession unprompted, when you soften your position to show good faith, you do not create warmth in the other side. You create a reed. They register your concession not as kindness, but as a signal, as evidence that movement is possible, that pressure applied patiently will produce more, that the distance between your opening position and your actual bottom line is shorter than you presented. Generosity offered without power behind it does not invite reciprocity. It invites appetite. The brutal, honest truth this reveals: every unprompted concession you make does not bring the deal closer. It simply raises the other side's estimate of what else they can extract before you hold firm. You are not building goodwill. You are teaching them exactly how to negotiate against you. The second mechanism, the illusion of shared interest. Most people enter negotiations with a quiet, comforting belief that both sides want the same thing: a fair deal, a resolution that works, a middle ground that reasonable people can find together if they communicate clearly enough. This belief is not entirely wrong, and that partial truth is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Yes, both sides want resolution, but what each side wants from that resolution is rarely symmetrical, and what each side is genuinely willing to do to achieve it is almost never equal. Machiavelli addressed this directly in Discourses on Livy, observing that men form alliances not out of shared values, but out of shared necessity. The moment necessity shifts, the moment one party's circumstances change, the moment a better option appears, the moment the cost of the agreement outweighs its benefit, the alliance dissolves. Not because people are dishonest by nature, because the foundation was never values, it was always interest. In a negotiation, the person across from you is not your partner moving toward a shared destination. They are a separate force operating under their own pressures, their own fears, their own constraints you cannot fully see. When you treat them as a partner, you lower your guard at precisely the moment you need it most. You start filling silences with explanation. You volunteer information about your timeline, your budget, your constraints, because you believe transparency builds trust. You interpret their hesitation as confusion rather than strategy, and they collect every piece of it. Not because they are villains, because you handed it to them, and they would have been irrational not to use it. You were not building something together. You were both building in opposite directions. The third mechanism, the silence that speaks everything. This is the mechanism that costs people the most and the hardest to see because it operates not in what is said, but in what is not said. Power in a negotiation does not arrive loudly.
It does not announce itself with aggression or dominance or theatrical confidence. It arrives in stillness, in the capacity to let silence sit without filling it, in the ability to receive an offer, pause and say nothing, and mean everything. Machiavelli returned repeatedly in The Prince and in his letters to the nature of the fox, the counterpart to the lion. The lion uses force, the fox uses cunning, and cunning at a negotiating table is almost entirely the management of information and silence. The person who speaks first after an offer is made reveals their anxiety. The person who explains their position without being asked reveals their insecurity. The person who fills every pause with words is narrating in real time exactly where they are afraid. Machiavelli wrote, in essence, that the prudent man says only what necessity compels him to say. Everything beyond that is a gift to the other side. Most people lose negotiations not in the dramatic moments, not when numbers are being argued or terms are being contested. They lose in the quiet moments, in the pause after an offer where discomfort pushed them to keep talking, in the moment they explained why they needed this deal and handed the other side the single lever required to move them completely. Power is not what you say, it is what you withhold, and what the other side imagines you are capable of in the space where your words are not.
Here's the thing Machiavelli understood that will unsettle you. Not because it is shocking, not because it is extreme, because some quiet part of you has always suspected it was true, and you have been hoping, in room after room, deal after deal, that you would find evidence to the contrary. You won't. A negotiation is not a conversation between two people seeking fairness. It is a revelation of necessity. Not who prepared more, not who has the stronger case or the more reasonable position or the superior logic. It is a revelation of who needs this more, and more precisely, who has made the other side believe they need it more. That single asymmetry, not intelligence, not preparation, not even leverage, is what determines the outcome of almost every negotiation ever conducted between human beings. This is the reframe that changes everything. When you walk into a negotiation, you are not being evaluated on the quality of your offer. You are being evaluated on the weight of your alternatives, on whether the other side senses, not thinks, but senses, the way people sense things in rooms before they can articulate why, that you can walk away from this and survive it, that this deal, however good, is not the last deal, that you are a man with options, not a man with a deadline. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince directly and without softening, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Most people read this as the advice of a tyrant. They recoil from it. They file it under darkness and move on. They miss everything. What Machiavelli was naming is not cruelty. It is a precise psychological observation about what actually governs human behavior in moments of contest and pressure. Love, goodwill, warmth, the desire to be liked and seen as reasonable, is fragile. It depends on the other side's mood, on their circumstances, on their competing pressures. It evaporates the moment their necessity shifts. Fear, not terror, but the quiet, unspoken awareness that you have genuine alternatives, that you are not desperate, that walking away is something you are fully capable of and fully prepared for, is durable. It does not require the other side to feel warmly toward you. It requires only that they believe the cost of pushing too far is real. This is not a call to be cold. It is a call to be understood correctly. When the other side perceives that you need this deal, truly need it emotionally, financially, strategically, they do not become more generous in response to your need. They become more patient. They apply small, measured pressures and observe how you respond. They make micro-offers, designed not to close the deal, but to test where your floor actually is. They wait. And while they wait, you negotiate against yourself, filling the silence with concessions they never asked for, explaining your position in ways that reveal your constraints, softening terms you had no reason to soften. But when they perceive that you are present without being attached, interested without being desperate, something fundamental shifts in the room. The silences change texture. The pressure finds nowhere to grip. Suddenly, they are the ones making adjustments. Suddenly, the concessions begin moving in both directions. Machiavelli observed in Discourses on Livy, in essence, that men will always find and exploit the path of least resistance. In a negotiation, that path runs directly through your attachment to the outcome. The reframe, stated without softening, is this: you do not win negotiations by wanting the deal less. You win by being genuinely, structurally prepared to survive without it, and by allowing that preparation to show, not in your words, but in your stillness. This is virtù in its most practical and most demanding form. Not aggression, not performance, not the theatrical confidence of a man pretending he doesn't care, but the cultivated, built, earned inner capacity to remain unmoved, to let Fortuna do what it will with the surface of the negotiation while your foundation stays solid beneath it. Most people prepare for negotiations by strengthening their argument. Machiavelli would tell you that is almost irrelevant. First, build your exit. Make it real, make it detailed, make it viable enough that when you sit across from the other side, the absence of this deal is not catastrophe. It is simply one outcome among several you have already prepared for. Then walk in. Because here is the paradox at the heart of everything Machiavelli understood about power. The moment you genuinely do not need the deal, you become the most dangerous person in the room.
If you have truly absorbed what Machiavelli saw, not as philosophy, not as history, but as the operating reality of every room where something is at stake, then certain ways of moving become not strategies you adopt, but natural consequences of understanding. You do not choose them because they are clever. You move this way because you cannot unsee what you have seen. The first consequence: build your exit before you build your case. Most people prepare for negotiations by refining their offer, sharpening their numbers, anticipating objections, rehearsing their reasoning. Machiavelli would begin somewhere else entirely. In The Prince, he returned obsessively to the concept he called arms of one's own, the idea that a ruler who relies on borrowed strength, on external support, on the goodwill of allies he does not control, is always vulnerable, always one shift of circumstance away from having nothing to stand on. The negotiating equivalent of borrowed arms is a deal you cannot afford to lose. When this deal is the only deal, when there is no alternative you have genuinely built, no other path you have genuinely prepared, you do not enter the negotiation as a free man. You enter it as a man whose constraints are visible, whether you reveal them or not. People sense dependency the way they sense fear, not through the words you choose, but through the texture of how you hold yourself when pressure arrives. The first and most important work you do before any significant negotiation is not preparation of your position, it is construction of your alternative. Build it out completely. Make it specific. Make it viable. Make it real enough in your own mind that when you sit across from the other side and they apply pressure, when they go silent, when they counter low, when they suggest they have other options, your foundation does not shift. Because a man with a real exit does not flinch, and the other side feels that stillness before you say a single word. The second consequence: use silence as architecture. Machiavelli's fox does not speak unnecessarily. Every word beyond what necessity demands is information surrendered. Every explanation offered without being asked is a window opened into your constraints, your timeline, your emotional investment in the outcome.
Every silence you cannot tolerate is a tell, as precise and readable as a physical gesture. The practical consequence of understanding this is simple and extraordinarily difficult to execute. After you make an offer, stop. Not pause, stop. Let the silence exist. Let it grow uncomfortable. Let it press against the other side with the full weight of everything they do not know about you. Do not interpret their silence as confusion and rush to clarify. Do not interpret their hesitation as displeasure and rush to soften. Sit inside the discomfort as though it does not touch you, because in that silence something is happening that no argument could produce. The other side is filling the space with their own imagination. They are constructing a version of you, your alternatives, your patience, your willingness to walk, based entirely on what you are not revealing. And the version they construct in silence is almost always more formidable than the version you would present if you kept talking. Machiavelli understood that the fox wins not by saying the right thing, but by allowing the other side to talk themselves into the right conclusion. Silence is not the absence of negotiation, it is negotiation at its most sophisticated. The third consequence: never explain, never justify, never apologize for your position. This is where Machiavelli's understanding of human nature becomes most practically powerful and most uncomfortable to apply. In The Prince, he observed that men judge by appearances far more than by reality. They respond to what seems true with far more force than they respond to what is true. And what seems true in a negotiation is shaped almost entirely by how you carry your position, not by the merits of the position itself. When you explain why your price is what it is, you are implicitly suggesting it requires defense. When you justify your terms, you are signaling that challenge is welcome. When you apologize for a position, even subtly, even with tone, you are telling the other side that you are not fully committed to it, that it is a starting point, not a boundary. Machiavelli would have you state your position once, clearly, without elaboration, and then wait. Not coldly, not theatrically, simply, with the quiet confidence of a man who has made a reasonable offer and has no anxiety about whether it will be accepted, because he has already made peace with the alternative. This does not mean rigidity. Machiavelli celebrated adaptability, the prince who reads circumstances and adjusts. Movement is not weakness when it is chosen. When you move your position in response to new information, to genuine reciprocity, to a shift in the structure of the deal, that is virtue. That is intelligent adaptation. But movement in response to pressure alone, movement born of discomfort, of silence you could not hold, of the other side's displeasure you could not tolerate, that is fortuna controlling you. That is the negotiation happening to you rather than through you. The fourth consequence: the price of this knowledge. Here is what Machiavelli never softened, and what you must not soften either. Everything described above has a cost. Building real alternatives requires real work, often before a specific negotiation is even on the horizon. Holding silence requires a tolerance of discomfort that most people never develop because it is easier to talk. Stating your position without justification requires a level of inner security that cannot be performed. It can only be built slowly, through the accumulation of moments where you held when everything in you wanted to fold. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, in essence, that there is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to manage than to initiate a new order of things. Becoming the kind of man who negotiates from genuine strength is a new order. It will feel unnatural. It will produce discomfort in others who preferred the version of you that was easier to move. Some negotiations will end without a deal, and you will have to live inside that outcome without the comfort of having compromised your position to avoid it. That is not failure. That is the price of operating from strength rather than fear. And the man who pays that price consistently, who builds his exits, holds his silence, states his position without apology, and moves only when he chooses, becomes something the other side has no reliable strategy against. Not because he is ruthless, because he is free.
There is a reason Machiavelli kept returning to the negotiating table, not as a metaphor, but as a literal site of human revelation, because nowhere else is the truth about men more visible. Strip away the social pleasantries, the professional courtesy, the carefully maintained fictions of collaboration and mutual respect, and what remains at a negotiating table is the oldest human dynamic in existence. Two forces, two sets of necessities, two people discovering in real time who actually holds the ground they are standing on. Machiavelli did not find this depressing. He found it clarifying. In Discourses on Livy, he wrote, in essence, that men never do good unless necessity drives them, that virtue, in the practical sense, is almost always the product of constraint rather than character, that what looks like strength in a man is rarely innate, it is built, forged in the specific pressure of moments where folding was easier and he held anyway. This is what negotiation reveals. Not about tactics, not about deals, but about the man conducting them. Every time you fold under pressure you did not need to fold under, you learn something about where your floor actually is. Every time you hold, not rigidly, not theatrically, but with the quiet solidity of a man who has built his alternatives and made peace with his outcomes, you move that floor. Slowly, imperceptibly sometimes, but permanently. Machiavelli watched empires negotiate their own collapse, not through military defeat, not through inferior resources, but through the accumulated weight of concessions made from fear rather than strategy, through leaders who confused reasonableness with strength, through men who wanted to be liked across the table more than they wanted to be respected. The world has not changed in 5 centuries. The tables are different, the stakes wear different clothing, but the mechanism is identical, and the man who understands it carries something into every room that cannot be taught in a seminar or read in a manual. He carries the knowledge of what is actually happening, and that knowledge, cold, clear, and entirely without comfort, is the only negotiating advantage that cannot be taken from you. You cannot be outmaneuvered by a game you have finally learned to see. If this way of thinking speaks to something in you, there is more where this came from. Machiavelli left enough truth behind to last a lifetime of study.